Okay. Good girl. Good girl. Good girl. That's the perfect spot, I think. I think that's the perfect spot where people can see you. Yeah, it is. Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is the garden question and answer video that I do most weeks on Sunday. You can ask gardening questions down below in the comments, and I pick from those each week. I've picked 20 something from this past week. There are lots and lots of questions. Thank you guys for participating in the video, because without your questions, there is no video. This past week on the Learn to Garden video series, the video that I put on there was a video about wholesale plant shopping, being able to go to wholesale nurseries. She's laid down right here, and I don't think you guys are going to be able to see it, right in the middle of this dugout clay pit that I'm standing in. I've dug out the area for the patio to go in, and I have a big tour group coming here this week, so I've got, in the next couple of days, I've got to get a base down in here. I'm not going to be able to get the stone and the brick laid, but I'm going to get the base in so at least people can walk through here comfortably. But the video that went up on the Learn to Garden series is about wholesale plant shopping, finding places where you can save some money on plants, buying directly from people who grow the plants. So I hope that has some value to the people who have bought the Learn to Garden video series. It's over on my website if you want to take a look at it, and there's a discount code down below this video. I put up another plant combo video this week on the HortTube channel on shade. It was a shade plant combo, but I'm doing these combo videos not so much that it has to be this exact combo that I'm talking about. I'm more talking about just how to go about picking out plants that blend well together in the garden and how each individual plant can stand out from others. That's the point of those videos. And then there's a video on super compact plants for evergreen shrubs that can be kept 2 feet or lower for sun, and another video for shade. So that was some of the content that went up this week. Thank you guys for watching and following along. So let's get to some questions from last week. So somebody wants a shrub that they can block their neighbor with, who cuts his Bermuda grass and then blows it into their garden strip that they're trying to create. And then Bermuda is growing in their bed. If you have a Bermuda grass issue like that, you're only going to stop it with a physical barrier. There's no shrub that's really going to help with that, because he's just going to blow the Bermuda grass, right through it. So I think you need some sort of physical barrier. You need a fence, with a board that goes right down to the ground, or some sort of concrete, stone, whatever it is. Only physical barriers are pretty much the only thing that stop Bermuda grass. And even then, sometimes, again, I have a video on the channel, because I consider it the hardest, the absolute hardest thing to garden with. And it's just, there's a few spots still in this garden where you think you have it and you don't have it, and it's in something. It grows so fast, and it can grow so stealthy through things as well. By the time you see it popping up through something, sometimes in your garden beds, it's extensive, hard to get rid of. Okay, so somebody asked about pruning. This is the loropetalum question of the week, and that's actually how they phrased it. They've got a loropetalum that's stretching up big, and they want to cut it down. Cut down the growth. How can they prevent this stretching? It's in too much shade, then it's in too much shade. It's always going to stretch back up. But that doesn't mean you can't control that. This one right here, this Carolina Midnight, it's definitely stretching. This oak tree behind me is so dominant over it that it's definitely stretching, but I'm able to keep it pretty full and lush, but I'm pruning it multiple times a year. So after it spring blooms, I prune down about maybe 6 feet out of the top of it. And then sometime in the summer, I'm gonna have to prune it a bit again. And I need to prune it a little bit right now because it's very wispy. And I mentioned that there was a tour video earlier in the week, and I mentioned that I need to do some general pruning on it anyway, because the branch is getting really heavy when it rains. And I think that if I had rain and wind at some point, that it could break apart a bit on me. But if you have a plant in too much shade and it's stretching, the only way to keep it full is keep pruning it. You're gonna have to prune it more than you will other things. Okay, so somebody said their agapanthus aren't blooming. They got killed to the ground in zone 8 by that December freeze, and they're up and they're lush, but they're not blooming. I have a lot that aren't blooming. I can see 2 white agapanthus over here that are opening, But I have lots that are just in the grass stage. I'm not worried about it at all. They'll bloom eventually during the summer. Hi, Holly, we're not going to eat dirt. No, ma'am. No, ma'am. I fed you well. I fed you well. You don't need dirt. Okay, you just lay there. There was a question about Holly and her these nodes, this growth she has under her neck. She's comfortable with them, and we've just kind of made a decision with a vet that at 14 years old or over, she's over 14, that we're not going to put her through something extensive. She's breathing okay. She's able to walk 3 times a day, and so they kind of are what they are. It would be a major thing to interfere with them at this point at her age. So that's where we are with Holly. I am watching her, you know, I mean, she's 14 and she's 70 pounds. You know, I'm watching her every day get a little bit slower. I'm dreading the hot part of the summer because right now, it's been so cool this spring. I've been able to keep up this. We do an early morning walk, and then I'll typically do some sort of, you know, some work, and then we'll go on some sort of shorter walk mid-morning, and then in the evening we take a third. She walks 3 times a day, and she's the first one at the door, you know, to walk. So she's still energetic, still eating, doing all those kinds of things. So right now we're just going with it and not putting her through something major that could be that setback that triggers something else. That's just the conversation we've had. But again, she's 14, and we all know when 70-pound dogs reach 14, that's life. But this one is, she's a great dog. She's a great dog. She's under me more and more and more, which is interesting. I mean, we've always been close together. I mean, she's worked with me at she had the nursery. She had a garden center where she greeted customers. She's had this garden as a, you know, she's had a pretty daggone good life. She's ridden in a pickup truck her whole life, which is, you know, you open a pickup. I got a guy up here 2 houses from me, and he's always got a couple pickups parked out at the street. And if there's a door open on one, she's in it. There's a pickup. But, you know, she's had the life. She's had the life, but it's definitely, you know, there's a slow, steady decline, as you would expect. Okay. Let's see. So somebody wants a full sun climbing vine, and they're in zone 7A in Oklahoma City. I probably think that you know, that wind and cold that you have there probably eliminates some of our evergreen vines like star jasmine that somebody might say will grow in zone 7. You're probably not going to be able to do very well there. And then some of the other evergreen vines are probably not going to be so evergreen out there. So for me, I'm probably going to use some sort of honeysuckle or clematis. I'll go ahead and say clematis just so I'm not corrected. Both are fine. You could use some native wisteria, the Kentucky wisteria. We have a couple native wisterias that would work great. Bignonia is another one, but that one can get a little bit crazy for sure. I've got a bignonia planted back here, and there's a video coming on the Garden Plants with Jim Putnam channel, I hope in the next week or so. I shot it this past week on bignonia. That video's coming, but we have lots of native vines that you can use there in zone 7. Clematis isn't, but the others are. So somebody asked about insect problems that keep returning. So you just have, you know, you're just constantly stressed about this plant that just gets, you know, it gets aphids every year, it gets scale every year, it gets whatever it gets every year. Those are plants I just remove. I don't understand. For me personally, I would not be in a battle with something. I have things out here that get little minor problems, but it doesn't interfere with them actually blooming or performing well in the garden, then I don't worry about them. If it was interfering with it, you know, doing its whatever I'm trying to get out of that plant, whatever that plant's supposed to be doing for me in this design, then I would just pull it out and get rid of it. So you know, it's just my thoughts on it. I'm not going to get into a cycle. If you have something that returns every year, that means now you're in a cycle of having to spray that thing forever and ever and ever. And not something I want to be doing. So if I have a problem that just keeps returning, that plant's eliminated, you know, edited from the garden, basically. You know, I'll leave that kind of stuff up to you, but if you have a problem that keeps returning, that plant's under some sort of potentially some undue stress, you can try moving it first. That's what I always say. Try moving it first. If that doesn't work, you know, then edit it from your life so you don't have to worry about it constantly. That would be my thought. All the annuals are starting to bloom out here, and I've noticed them. I got bluebirds back in the bluebird house, a second round of those. And then I've had, the birds love landing on top of that red bud. So normally I'm standing with my back to that spot, and you guys will be able to see, but I've had this cardinal land there several times now. This bright red bird on top of that gold red bud. And then the bees are just swarming all of these salvia back here. So it's kind of fun to watch this, you know, June 1st period of time. You know, the garden is really, you know, really coming to life. Okay, Jim's easily distracted. So somebody has somebody asked, will kaleidoscope abelia go dormant in zone 7B? No, meaning will it lose a lot of its leaves? They can. See, abelia are going to be hardy from like zone 6 to 9. In zone 6, typically abelia will get a little bit thinner than they do here in zone 7. But if we had a cold enough winter, it will thin the abelia a bit more. Just depends on the winter we're having. But for the most part in zone 7B, they're going to be reliably evergreen. The one thing about kaleidoscope is it does turn bright colors in the wintertime, like orangey colors, and sometimes it's can be clashy. You have to think about the things you're putting with kaleidoscope, how that's going to look in the wintertime. It's a pretty plant, but it does stand out in the winter garden, that's for sure, hence the name kaleidoscope. So somebody has a dry, what I call a dry socket around newly planted plants. They're frequently, you know, you'll buy a plant if it's super root bound or it's been grown in a really chunky bark mix that doesn't hold water very well. Your soil may hold water and be easy to keep the soil in the garden bed wet, but it's difficult to actually water the socket where the actual plant is sitting down in the ground. And I hope that makes sense. I've got a gardenia over here I planted in the Learn to Garden series, just on how to plant plants as part of that series. And I'm having to water just that middle part of that socket of where the actual soil from the pot was. It's dry. The surrounding soil is totally wet. You will run into that occasionally. I sometimes will pull things back out of the ground and break that up just a little bit more if that's happening. But you will run into that. That's something, if you plant enough plants in the garden, you will run into this phenomenon where your surrounding soil can be wet, but that plant dries out over and over and over. It's not having roots out into that surrounding soil. It will pretty quickly, but keep an eye on those dry sockets. You know, you can, again, pull them out of the ground if you want to. It's not going to hurt anything. Pull the roots out, tickle the roots a little bit more, pull them out a little bit more, and then replant it. And sometimes that will help that area absorb water a little bit better. Okay, so somebody asked about, I guess you can see it, this Platinum Beauty Lamandra. I can't see if you can see it right here where I got it. That one was from plantsbymail.com. I did an unboxing video where I got a lot of stuff from Plants by Mail. Maybe a month and a half ago or something, that video went up. There's a link down below the video for Plants by Mail if you want to do any shopping with them. That's up to you. It's not a salesman-y thing at all. So, okay, still getting lots of questions about pruning the damaged plants from the December freeze. One was on Osmanthus fragrans. So their Osmanthus fragrans got defoliated from the cold. It was leafing out pretty good, and then they got a late frost, and that knocked it back again. And now it just has growth out on the newest limb, you know, out on the ends of the limbs, but it's naked down in the middle. That plant ultimately is going to need to be sheared back some, but I would wait till it's growing pretty vigorously. So it's already been through 2 stresses. Now I got a ruby-throated hummingbird on the, man, I don't, you know, I should have had the camera the other way today. You're eventually going to need to prune it. You may want to wait until you're getting some more vigorous growth on it because it's already been through 2 stresses, 2 hard freezes. So maybe wait till mid-June sometime when you see it really starting to grow a little faster, and go and shear it. You know, go back and shear it off. Even if you took every leaf off, once you know it's got the engine going again, you can shear it back, and that will create some new growth down in the middle of it. But I don't do it when I feel like the plant's still under a lot of stress. All right, let's see. So somebody asked me what the roses blush blueberry looks like in the winter time in zone 7. It's called roses blush because it has that kind of blush color during the winter. It does stay evergreen here, you know, even in zone 7, but it is definitely a kind of a rosy pink color during the winter time. It's quite attractive during the winter time. It's a native blueberry to the southeast. There's going to be a very detailed tour video of the entire garden coming in the next couple weeks. I'm going to wait for the annuals to start putting on a little bit more color, and then we're going to do a very detailed tour of everything, and you'll see that roses blush or anything else I'm talking about in that video. I'm going to basically go through and just name every plant and talk about them some. I haven't done that in a couple years, and there's actually some things out here that have never been talked about on the channel. We stick in plants in here constantly that don't end up necessarily in the content, but they will in the next couple weeks. So somebody has their Natchez crepe myrtles blooming, but their red rocket crepe myrtles not blooming. That's completely normal. Natchez is pretty much one of the first crepe myrtles to go off every year. So almost all crepe myrtles seem to be white for a few weeks, and then the other ones start to bloom a little bit later. And we always had that at the nursery. We still have pretty good traffic at our retail locations when Natchez started blooming, but by the time some of the others started blooming, you know, mid-June, a lot of the traffic had died off at that point. So, but Red Rocket and Dynamite were probably my two best-selling crepe myrtles toward the end of my time in the nursery and garden center business. Those two real, actual red crepe myrtles. We always called Tuscarora and a bunch of the dark pink crepe myrtles red for years, and then actual red crepe myrtles came along. So somebody has they're using leaf mold as mulch, and so they have a bunch of roly-polies in it, and wondered, I guess, if they were eating you know, their vegetation in some way, their seedlings and other things that were coming up. Roly-polies only eat material that's breaking down. So it's, you know, they're basically, you know, they're breaking down stuff into smaller things that then earthworms and other things can break down even further. You know, they're part of the process of starting to make things available. And you know, they said they do have slugs out there as well. So I suspect that the leaf mold is a hiding place for snails and slugs. And it's one of those things, I leave my leaves out here during the winter time, but then as spring and summer comes on, I kind of want that stuff to be broken down a little bit. It's good. It's really good hiding places. You know, these big leaves. You know, I've got this evergreen magnolia, southern magnolia, that's on the property behind us, and it drops these big leaves out here. Those big leaf laying on the ground like that, it's the perfect hiding place. You know, giving a little moisture under that leaf for a slug or a snail. So those two things may come together. You know, that leaf mold initially, you know, before it starts to break down as a hiding place for snails and slugs. But the roly-polies shouldn't be causing you any problems, and they should actually be taking that material and starting the process of making it, the nutrients that are in it, available for the, you know, the plants that are in your garden. So they're kind of an important part of the system. So somebody sprayed RM43, which is a systemic herbicide. So it's glyphosate, which was Roundup. That's been off patent for a long time. So you can just buy it as glyphosate, you know, Roundup brand. Not in the Roundup brand. You can just buy it as a separate product, but it's glyphosate and one other chemical combined together. It's actually, the other chemical is designed to bind to the soil. So it basically becomes a systemic herbicide. Did I say insecticide? Herbicide. I may have said insecticide, but it's a systemic herbicide. I'm very tired. I went to the Dead and Company show last night. It's the final tour for the, supposed to be the final tour for the last few members of the Grateful Dead, plus John Mayer, and it was, you know, it was a blast, but I am definitely tired. And I may be mixing up my words this morning. But it's a systemic herbicide, so it stays in the soil for like a year. They wanted to know how long before they could start planting things. I think shrubs and trees, you know, not that long, but any kind of vegetable, I'm definitely not eating out of it for a couple years probably. And, you know, any of these kind of tender annuals and things and perennials, I'm probably not going to plant in it for well over a year. Shrubs about a year, but that it is a systemic herbicide, which, you know, but they had to spray it. So no, this is no knock to them at all. They had a lot of poison ivy in their garden, highly allergic, ended up hospitalized. It's absolutely the point where you're going to break out. I mean, this is what chemicals are made for, is kind of those types of situations where, what the heck am I going to do with poison ivy if I've got a yard full of it? You know, but it puts the brakes on them being able to do other things in the garden for a while. So, you know, sometimes we're quick to judge things, you know, that we don't understand or whatever, but it's no big deal. They sprayed it, they had no choice. Here we are. Now the question becomes, when can I start gardening in this space? A year. Okay. So somebody asked about showing at what point that I water containers, how dry or how it looks when I need to water the container. You'll notice any soil you use in a container is going to be one color when it's wet, and it's going to be another color when it's dry. Generally speaking, they're dark colored. You know, the soil, whether it's bark or compost or peat moss or whatever the heck it is that's in your containers, it's going to be a dark color when it's wet, and it's going to be a lighter color when it's dry. So I just look for that color change. That crust on the top of that pot will change, and then I'll dig down a bit and see where we are in that color change. You know, how far down has it gotten dry? And if it's down a couple inches, at that point I'm probably going to go ahead and water it. But I like to keep a little bit of a dry socket right on top of my containers. I don't panic water when I see the color change right on the top. That little dry space on the top of any container you have is keeps weed seeds from germinating. You know, having that little dry space right on top. But that's all I'm looking for, is the color change. I can walk by any of these containers. We've had rain recently, and I can just see how dark the soil is on top of them. So I know they don't need any water, and they won't need it for, these are all newly planted things, so they won't need it for a few days. Your older things will just need to be watered every day. So you'll get to the point where you're just like, I know I have to water the containers. But for right now, I just look for the color change, and then I check from there. I want to get a couple inches down dry material before I'm watering them. I want them to root down in the bottom of that pot, chase water a little bit. Okay, so somebody wants to put a tree ring around their olive tree. They're out in Vegas. They got grass growing right up to the base of it, and they want to get some sort of a bed created around it. And what was the best way to do that? Olives actually have very shallow root systems. You think about most plants that grow in Mediterranean conditions, dry conditions, typically have very deep, you know, tap roots, and they root deep into the ground chasing water. But olives actually have very shallow root systems. So you're going to do a little bit of damage taking the grass out. You have the option of just covering the grass, maybe a section at the time with boxes or some sort of sheet of plastic. Just cover some, maybe not plastic, but you could use boxes or something like that to try to kill the grass that way, or you can take a flat shovel. For me, I'm going to cut the ring that I'm going to use, whatever shape that bed's going to be, and then I'm just going to take a flat shovel and remove the grass. And I'm going to do a little bit of damage to a few shallow roots on that tree, but I'm not going to worry about it. If it's an established thing, you're not going to hurt it that bad. So I talk about staying out of the beds to keep, you know, the more traffic you put into the beds, the more likely you are to have lots of weeds during the summertime, because those disturbances in that mulch layer, which squirrels do mostly for me, is going to create spaces where you're bringing soil up. You're going to get more weed seeds. Somebody has their bird feeder, you know, and the birds come along and they scratch up the mulch. They scratch up everything. They're basically planting sunflower seeds, and they have stuff growing under there constantly. So do we. Don't have, you know, I'll take the little weeding hoe that we have underneath it and just 5 or 6 times cut all the sunflowers off occasionally. I have found that growing a ground cover under it. So I've got creeping Jenny. I'll break a piece off of here. Our front bird feeder has creeping Jenny up under it. That has prevented most of the weeds from coming up through it. Holly thinks it's going to be food there, I think. But that's been super helpful. The back one back here does not have, it's just seed laying on the ground, so I know it's going to start germinating right there. But the front one, The creeping jennies really helped keep the weeds, keep the seed from germinating. Okay, let's see. Somebody asked about pine straw improving their soil. So, you know, the mulches that I'm using out here, the compost, whether it be compost, humus, cow manure, pine bark, hardwood mulch, wood chips, doesn't matter what it is, all these things are being put out here to break down and improve soil. And they were asking if pine straw, how effective pine straw is at improving the soil. Not great. You know, you're buying this thing that looks like it's pretty dry, right? Pine needles in the bale, that pine needles individually look pretty dry at that point, but they're not at all. They're still mostly water, and you'll see them just shrink, you know, over the course of, especially if you put them down now, June, over the course of the next 60 days, you just see them shrink, you know, to almost nothing. The water continues to dry out of it, and it's just, there's not a lot of mass in it. There's not a lot of actual organic material. The weight of that bale that you're carrying still seems to be a lot of water weight. So any organic material you put down is going to help, and it's going to help protect, it's going to help hold in moisture, and it's going to help protect, you know, earthworms and other things that are helping you in your soil. But in terms of it actually being the thing being broken down that's going to feed your plants and improve your soil, not a lot in comparison to other things. That's just been my experience using pine straw. Of course, if you've got pines and you've got pine straw, you might as well use it, but it's definitely not as good. Let's see, so somebody has their yews, they're in zone 5A, and their yews are turning bronze. That bronzing on yews is definitely stress, and so it can be winter winds can cause that bronzing. That can be a stress that causes it. Overwatering for sure can be something that will bronze your yews. It can be, you know, pushing them with too much fertilizer. It can be, you know, it's a stress. Bronzing on yews is a stress. A lot of times it'll just go away and even back out, but if it's overwatering, that won't happen. So be careful with the amount of watering that you're doing on, you know, on your yews. But that's just how, you know, a lot of plants will, you know, leafy evergreens especially are helpful at kind of letting you know a bit what's going on with them. You know, if you have a leafy evergreen shrub and it's got some yellow leaves in the interior, typically that means it was dry at some point. Doesn't necessarily mean it was dry that day, but at some point over the last few weeks, it got dry enough that it thinned some interior leaves. If you get new leaves that are yellowing and they're off color, that could be some sort of nutrient deficiency, a lot of times being caused by overwatering. So they're, you know, leafy evergreens, perennials, these leafy plants, they're pretty, I can look at them and kind of go, well, I can make guesses, right? Conifers, a lot of times I just can't make a guess. Every dang thing that happens to a yew turns it bronze. So it's one of those things, but overwatering is, you know, the most likely a lot of times. I mean, that's the majority of plants that I see damaged are being loved to death. So somebody has their annuals are not thriving in mulch, and this is just true for, you know, I did a consultation the other day with someone, and, you know, our annuals are, you know, all of my annuals out here are jumping because they're in compost, mostly compost. There's a little bit of pine bark on top of them, but I didn't need to add the pine bark outside of it. I was trying to do a little weed prevention by having the pine bark on top of these little annual beds, but it's mostly just compost. But they thrive in that compost, heavy, rich, organic soil. They don't tend to thrive in the beds with, you know, hardwood mulch, you know, up to their necks as well. Doesn't mean they won't perform, but they definitely would prefer just to go in that straight compost. So somebody asked me what I do with my surplus of veggies every summer. I've got several neighbors that will have come and pick, especially if we're out of town. We'll tell people to come over here and just, you know, and grab them. And then, you know, it's always a joke when I was a kid, don't leave your car unlocked at church or you're gonna go home with squash. Because, you know, we do get to this point in the summertime where there's more than you can possibly eat. But we try to give it away. We've got a lot of our neighbors, you know, don't have vegetable gardens, and so they appreciate some fresh summer produce. Let's see. Somebody asked about me doing a live Q&A at some point. I would like to do that, and I haven't ever thought about setting it up, but I do. I get asked to speak a lot, and the rest of the summer, I think I have three 3 pretty substantial speaking events. I'm actually speaking twice at Cultivate, which is a big horticulture gathering up in Columbus, Ohio in, gosh, that's in the middle of July. And then the week after that, the beginning of August, I have a speaking thing. And I always do, my point of this is I always leave like half the time just to do live question and answer. It's actually my favorite. This might be my favorite thing. I've been doing this for so long, for 30 some years, that, you know, I've heard all the questions. I've heard a lot of the questions. That doesn't mean I have all the answers, but I've heard a lot of questions in the last 33 years, plus doing these Q&As, you know, on the channel. So I do enjoy live Q&As, and they're always so funny because there'll be most of the crowd doesn't know who I am, but, you know, or why I'm even there. And I'll get the first tentative question from someone, and then I'll answer it, I guess, well enough that then now there's 2 hands. And then the next thing you know, literally everybody in the audience is waiting to ask a question, and the moderator has to cut it off. So that's how those live Q&As typically go for me. They're like, oh, he can answer questions. He can really answer questions. Those are always fun. And it's the better part, rather than talking to people with slides and pointing stuff out, I'd rather, you know, let's get to the meat of this thing and answer some questions I know you have about gardening that maybe I can help with. Okay, last question for this week. Somebody asked if they can stretch the zones of a lilac into the south by having them in containers. So if you have a lilac that's supposed to be zone 3 to 7, which most lilacs you're gonna see are something like zone 2 to 7. Most species of lilacs are gonna be like that. And in zones like zone 7B, by the time where I'm at, you may not get as much cold on them. There are exceptions to that. I have a Korean lilac that's an exception to that, and there are others that are an exception to that. Somebody pointed out in last week's Q&A that they see some of the Asian lilacs in zone 8. So there's definitely exceptions to that. But yes, any plant that you want to move a zone further south, yes, having it elevated in a container is going to be the best way to do that, so that the roots get exposed. They get exposed a little bit more to some cold during the winter time. You can probably, where I always talk about I have something in a container that's at least 1 or 2 cold hardiness zones, more cold hardy than my area. So I'm in zone 7B. This maple, this Japanese maple that's in this container, is zone 5 hardy. So it's definitely okay to leave it here in the winter. You can also do the opposite, you know, and take things that need more cold and put them in containers in the south to gain some cold, to gain some chill hours that way. So there you go. Thank you guys very much for asking questions and participating in this video. Ask your gardening questions down below, and I'll be back next week with another one. Thanks for watching.